My husband disappeared on a Tuesday. No warning, no fight, no note. I woke up, made coffee, called his name, and got nothing but silence. His side of the closet was empty. His car was gone, and when I checked our bank account, my heart stopped. Zero. Every single dollar we had was gone. 17 years of marriage, 2 kids, a house we built together, and he erased himself from our lives like we never existed. My name is Claire. And this is the story of how I found my husband, uncovered the truth about who he really was, and made sure he never hurt anyone again. That first morning, I didn't panic right away. I thought maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe his mother was sick. I called his phone. Straight to voicemail. I called his office. They told me Daniel hadn't shown up for work. I called his best friend, Tom. Tom said he hadn't heard from him in a week, which was unusual because they talked almost every day. By noon, the panic set in. I drove to the bank in person. I sat across from a woman named Patricia who looked at her screen and told me that our joint savings account, our checking account, and our emergency fund had all been emptied the previous evening between 6 and 8 p.m., while I was home making dinner for our kids, while I was helping our daughter with her science project. While I was living my normal life, Daniel was systematically draining every dollar we had. The total was $143,000. Patricia asked me if I wanted to file a fraud claim. I said I didn't know. Because technically, Daniel's name was on every one of those accounts. He had every legal right to withdraw the money. It wasn't theft, not in the eyes of the bank. It was just a husband taking money from a joint account. The fact that it destroyed his family was irrelevant to the banking system. I drove home in a fog. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could walk inside. My daughter Lily, who was 12, asked me where Dad was. I told her he had to go on a business trip. My son, Ethan, who was 8, didn't even look up from his iPad. He said okay and kept playing his game. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and cried until I couldn't breathe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling trying to understand what had happened. Daniel and I had been together since college. We met in a psychology class. He was funny. He was kind. He remembered little details about people that made them feel special. He was the kind of man that everyone trusted instantly. And now he was gone, and I had nothing. The next morning, I filed a missing persons report. The police were sympathetic but not particularly helpful. They told me that adults have the right to leave. That taking money from a joint account isn't a crime. That unless there was evidence of foul play, there wasn't much they could do. The officer suggested that Daniel might be going through a mental health crisis. He suggested I give it a few days. I gave it a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. No call, no email, no text. Nothing. Daniel had vanished completely. And with the money gone, the bills started piling up. The mortgage was due. The car payment was due. The utilities were due. The kids needed lunch money, school supplies, new shoes because Ethan was growing out of his old ones. I was a part-time bookkeeper working 20 hours a week because Daniel and I had agreed years ago that I would be home more for the children. I wasn't making enough to cover even half of our expenses. I started selling things. First, the things Daniel left behind. His golf clubs, his watch collection, a guitar he never learned to play. Then I started selling our things. A painting we bought on our honeymoon in Italy. The dining room set my grandmother had given us. I sold it all on Facebook Marketplace to strangers who showed up at my door, handed me cash, and drove away with pieces of my life in the back of their trucks. The hardest moment was when Lily asked me why the dining room was empty. I told her we were redecorating. She looked at me with those eyes, the same eyes Daniel had, and I could tell she didn't believe me. 12-year-olds are smarter than we give them credit for. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how wrong. I called Daniel's family, his parents, his sister. I thought maybe they knew where he was. Maybe they were helping him. His mother sounded genuinely shocked. She said she hadn't heard from Daniel either. She cried on the phone. She said she couldn't understand how her son could do this. His sister was less sympathetic. She said Daniel had always been selfish. She said she wasn't surprised. She said she was sorry, but she couldn't help me. She had her own family to worry about. My friends tried to be supportive. They brought meals. They offered to watch the kids. But I could see it in their eyes, the pity, the discomfort. And underneath that, the question they were all too polite to ask. How did you not see this coming? How did you live with this man for 17 years and not know? I asked myself that question every single day. And I still don't have a good answer. My mother offered to help. She gave me $3,000 from her retirement savings. money she couldn't afford to lose. I sat at her kitchen table and watched her write that check with shaking hands, and I wanted to tear it up. I wanted to tell her to keep it, but I couldn't, because the mortgage company didn't care about my pride. They cared about the payment. I took the money because I had no choice. I hated myself for taking it, and I hated Daniel even more for putting me in that position. After 6 weeks, I stopped crying. Something shifted inside me. The sadness didn't disappear, but it moved to the side, and something harder took its place. Something that felt like steel being forged. I started asking questions that I should have asked from the beginning. Why did Daniel leave so carefully? He didn't just walk out in a rage. He planned this. He emptied the accounts methodically. He packed while I was at work. He left no trace. This wasn't a man having a breakdown. This was a man executing a plan. I started going through everything Daniel had left behind, not his clothes or his belongings. Those were gone. I went through the things he didn't think to take. Old receipts in his desk drawer, credit card statements from the past year, his browser history on the family computer, which he apparently forgot to clear. And that's when I found the first crack in the story. 6 months before he disappeared, Daniel had opened a credit card in his name only, a card I knew nothing about. The statements showed charges at restaurants I had never been to, hotels in cities he had never mentioned visiting, and purchases at stores I didn't recognize. Over 6 months, he had spent almost $19,000 on this hidden card. Restaurants for 2, hotels on weeknights when he told me he was working late, weekend charges in a city 3 hours away when he told me he was at a conference. My stomach turned, but I kept digging. I found something else on the computer. A folder buried inside another folder inside another folder, labeled with a random string of numbers. Inside were documents, insurance forms, rental agreements, and a lease for an apartment in a city called Riverside, about 200 miles from our home. The lease was in Daniel's name. It had been signed 8 months before he disappeared. He had been paying rent on a second apartment for 8 months while living with me and our children. I sat at that desk for a long time. I remember my hands were shaking, not from sadness anymore, from something else. Something cold and focused. I called a divorce attorney the next morning, a woman named Sandra Chen who had been recommended by a friend. I sat in her office and told her everything, every detail. The empty accounts, the missing clothes, the silence. She listened without interrupting. She didn't write anything down, she just looked at me. When I finished, she leaned forward and said something I will never forget. She said, "Claire, your husband didn't just leave you. He orchestrated a financial abandonment. And in this state, that changes everything." I asked her what she meant. She explained that in our state, a spouse who deliberately drains joint assets before or during a divorce can be held liable for something called dissipation of marital assets. It means the court can treat it as if the money was stolen, even though technically it came from a joint account. The court can order the offending spouse to reimburse the other party for every dollar taken. But there was a catch. We had to find Daniel first. I asked Sandra how we were supposed to find someone who clearly didn't want to be found, someone who had been planning his disappearance for months. Sandra smiled and said she knew exactly who to call. I hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus. He was a retired police detective who had spent 20 years working missing persons cases before going independent. When I sat across from him in his small office downtown and told him my story, he didn't seem surprised. He told me he had seen this pattern before, more often than I would think. He said that the men who do this are never impulsive. They plan for months, sometimes years. They study the accounts. They wait for the right moment. And they always have somewhere to go. Marcus told me he would start with the apartment lease I had found on the computer, the one in Riverside. He said if Daniel was still there, he would find him within a week. If he had moved on, it would take longer. I told him I didn't care how long it took. I would wait. 3 days later, at 11 at night, Marcus called me. His voice was calm, but I could tell he was holding something back. He said he had found Daniel. He was living in the Riverside apartment. And then Marcus paused, a long pause. The kind of pause where you know the next words are going to change something. He said, "Claire, he's not alone. Daniel was living with a woman named Tessa. She was 29 years old. She worked at a real estate agency, and based on Marcus's initial observations, they had been together for a long time. This was not a fling. This was not something that started after Daniel left me. This had been going on for over a year while Daniel was still sleeping next to me every night. Marcus spent the next week in Riverside. He followed Daniel. He documented everything. He took photographs. He gathered details. and the picture that emerged was surreal. Daniel had built an entirely separate life. He had a favorite coffee shop where the baristas knew his order. He went to a gym 3 blocks from the apartment. He and Tessa had a routine. They walked to dinner on Tuesday nights. They went grocery shopping together on Saturday mornings. The neighbors in the apartment building told Marcus that Daniel and Tessa seemed like a perfectly normal, happy couple, that they had been there for months, that Daniel was friendly and helpful, that he once helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs. And here's the detail that made me feel like I was losing my mind. Daniel told everyone in Riverside that his name was David Mitchell. He had given everyone a completely fake name. The man I had been married to for 17 years, the father of my children, was walking around a different city pretending to be someone who didn't exist. Marcus sent me photos. Daniel at a restaurant with Tessa. Daniel walking out of a grocery store. Daniel sitting on a park bench reading a book in the sunlight like he didn't have a care in the world. Like he hadn't destroyed a family 200 miles away. Like Lily and Ethan didn't exist. I stared at those photos for a long time. I expected to feel destroyed. I expected the final confirmation of the affair to shatter me, but it didn't. I felt absolutely nothing. Not sadness, not rage, just a cold, empty clarity. I was past the point of pain. I had cried every tear I had. What was left was something else entirely. I was in the planning phase now, but here's where the story takes its first real turn, because what Marcus found next was something I never expected, something that changed everything. While investigating Daniel's background in Riverside, Marcus ran a basic public records search, and he discovered that Daniel had applied for a new driver's license in a neighboring state, under a different name. Not David, a completely different name. A name that, when Marcus ran it through a database, came back connected to a previous marriage. Daniel had been married before me, a marriage he had never told me about, not once in 17 years. His first wife was a woman named Karen. They had been married for 3 years in another state. And according to the divorce records, Karen had filed for divorce after discovering that Daniel had drained their joint bank accounts and disappeared. The exact same thing he did to me. I had to read that 3 times before it sank in. Daniel hadn't just cheated on me. Daniel hadn't just stolen from me. Daniel was a serial predator. He married women, gained their trust, spent years building a life with them, and then one day, without warning, he took everything and vanished. He had done it before. He was doing it to me, and if I didn't stop him, he would do it again to someone else. To Tessa. To whoever came after Tessa. I told Sandra everything Marcus had found. Sandra's entire demeanor changed. She went from sympathetic divorce attorney to someone who looked like she was preparing for war. She told me that what Daniel had done potentially constituted fraud, identity theft, and bigamy, depending on whether his first divorce was properly finalized. She made some calls. She brought in a colleague who specialized in criminal fraud cases. They found that Daniel's first divorce was finalized, so bigamy was off the table. But the pattern of financial abandonment across multiple marriages, combined with the use of false identities, opened the door to criminal fraud charges. Specifically, identity fraud and financial exploitation. Sandra filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment and dissipation of marital assets. The filing included a request for a forensic accounting of all of Daniel's financial activities over the past 3 years. And because Daniel was using a false identity in another state, Sandra was able to petition the court for an emergency asset freeze on any accounts in Daniel's real name or any known aliases. Daniel was served at the Riverside apartment. Marcus told me later that when the process server handed Daniel the papers, Daniel's face went completely blank. Not angry, not scared, just empty, like a machine that had been unplugged. He asked the process server who had sent them. The process server said, "Your wife," and Daniel apparently just stood there in the doorway for a full minute without saying a word. 2 weeks after being served, Daniel's attorney contacted Sandra. Daniel wanted to negotiate. He wanted this to go away quietly. He offered to return $60,000 of the $143,000 he had taken in exchange for a quick, uncontested divorce with no further claims. $60,000, less than half of what he stole. Sandra called me with the offer. She told me it was my decision. She told me that many people in my situation would take it. That litigation is expensive, exhausting, and unpredictable. That a guaranteed $60,000 is better than risking everything in court. I listened to everything she said. And then I said no, not because the money wasn't important. It was. My family was barely surviving. I was 3 weeks away from missing a mortgage payment. I had maxed out a credit card buying groceries. $60,000 would have changed my life at that moment, but I knew something Daniel didn't know I knew. I knew about Karen. I knew about the pattern. I knew that Daniel had done this before and gotten away with it. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I took the $60,000 and walked away, Daniel would do this again. Maybe to Tessa, maybe to someone after Tessa. Some woman somewhere would fall in love with that same charming smile and lose everything, just like me, just like Karen. I wasn't just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting to make sure there would never be another victim. I told Sandra to reject the offer and to make sure that our court filing included everything Marcus had found about Daniel's previous marriage and his history of financial abandonment. I wanted it on the public record. I wanted anyone who ever searched Daniel's name to find it. Daniel's attorney came back with a second offer, $100,000, a significant increase. Sandra asked me what I wanted to do. She told me honestly that $100,000 was a strong offer, that we might not get more in court. I said no again. I said I wanted all $143,000 returned, plus the $19,000 he spent on the secret credit card, plus my legal fees, plus the cost of the private investigator, plus compensation for the emotional and financial damage he had caused. The total came to approximately $185,000. Daniel's attorney said that was outrageous, that no judge would award that amount. Sandra looked at me. I nodded. Sandra turned back to the phone and said 4 words, "Then we'll see you in court." The court date came 4 months later. I barely slept the night before. I kept going over everything in my head, every document, every timeline, every lie Daniel had ever told me. I arrived at the courthouse an hour early and sat in my car in the parking lot, breathing slowly, reminding myself why I was doing this. Daniel showed up in a suit looking like the charming, trustworthy man everyone had always believed him to be. He smiled at the judge. He was polite. He was calm. He shook his own attorney's hand like they were about to play a round of golf. He had clearly prepared to perform. I could see it in the way he carried himself. This was the Daniel that everyone loved, the one who remembered birthdays and told the best stories at dinner parties, the one I had fallen in love with 20 years ago. For a brief moment, a tiny, horrible moment, I felt doubt. I wondered if I was making a mistake, if maybe there was an explanation, if maybe I was the one being unreasonable. And then I looked at Sandra's face. And Sandra's face told me everything I needed to know. Then Sandra began presenting evidence. She was methodical, almost surgical. She started with the bank records, the timestamps showing the accounts being drained while I was home with the children. She moved to the secret credit card, the hotel charges, the restaurant receipts for 2. She presented the lease for the Riverside apartment. She showed the judge Daniel's fake identity, the driver's license in another name, the previous marriage to Karen, the documented pattern of financial predation across multiple relationships. Daniel's smile disappeared about 3 minutes into Sandra's presentation. By the time she was showing the judge the lease agreement for the Riverside apartment signed under a fake name, Daniel was staring at the table in front of him. His attorney was whispering to him, but Daniel wasn't responding. He was frozen. But the moment that broke everything open was when Sandra called her final witness, Karen, Daniel's first wife. I didn't know Sandra had found her. I didn't know Sandra had contacted her. I didn't know Karen had flown in from another state specifically for this hearing. But there she was, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes who looked like she had spent the past decade carrying something heavy on her shoulders. The courtroom went quiet when Karen sat down. She took a breath, and then she told her story. She described meeting Daniel, how charming he was, how he made her feel like the most important person in the world, how they built a life together, how she trusted him completely. And then how one morning she woke up to an empty house and empty bank accounts. The same story, almost word for word. The same playbook, 12 years apart. 2 different women, the same man. When Karen described the years she spent blaming herself, wondering what she did wrong, wondering if she was crazy, I had to look away. Because I recognized every single word. Every feeling she described was a feeling I had felt. We were strangers who had lived the same nightmare. I looked at Daniel. His head was down, his hands were flat on the table. He wasn't performing anymore. The mask was gone, and underneath it was nothing. Just a man sitting in the wreckage of every lie he had ever told. The judge ruled in my favor on every count. full restitution of all marital assets. Daniel was ordered to pay back the entire $143,000, plus the $19,000 from the credit card, plus my legal fees, plus punitive damages for deliberate dissipation of marital assets. The total judgment was $212,000, but the money wasn't even the most important part. The most important part was that the judge referred Daniel's case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal fraud charges. And because the case was now public record, a local journalist picked up the story. She wrote an article about Daniel's pattern of financial predation. The article included his real name, his known aliases, and his photograph. Tessa, the woman Daniel had been living with in Riverside, read the article. She contacted the journalist, and she told her that Daniel had been telling her he was a divorced man with no children, that he had told her his name was David, that they had been planning to buy a house together, that she had already given Daniel access to her savings account. The cycle was about to repeat, and I had stopped it. The last I heard, Daniel was facing criminal charges in 2 states. His assets had been frozen, and every woman he had ever deceived now knew exactly who he was. I think about Daniel sometimes, not with anger anymore, not even with sadness. I think about him the way you think about a storm you survived. Something that tore through your life, destroyed things you thought were permanent, and then moved on. You rebuild, you plant new things, you make the walls stronger this time, and you never forget to check the sky. My daughter Lily is 14 now. She knows the truth about what happened, not every detail but enough. She told me recently that she's proud of me, that she's glad I didn't let him get away with it. My son Ethan is 10. He doesn't ask about his father anymore. He stopped asking about a year ago. That breaks my heart a little, but I think he's going to be okay. I think we're all going to be okay. If you're going through something like this, I need you to know something. You are not stupid for trusting someone. Trust is what good people do. The shame belongs to the person who exploited it, not to you. If this story hit you, drop a comment telling me what you would have done in Claire's situation. Would you have taken the $60,000 and walked away, or would you have fought for everything? I genuinely want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. I post stories like this every single week, and the next one is already in production. I promise you, it's just as intense as this one. I'll see you there.